Okay, good morning, everyone. I think we'll go ahead and get started. I know there's a couple of people still coming in, so please get settled in. And thank you for being here for this panel discussion on protecting the U.S. from influence operations, which is a remarkable and timely discussion to be having today for a number of reasons, which we'll probably get into. I'm Shane Harris. I cover intelligence and national security at the Washington Post. And I'm pleased to welcome you. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panel first, then give a couple of housekeeping notes. But I think probably you've got your programs here, but let me just kind of briefly introduce everyone so you know who they are. I'm joined by Rand Waltzman, who is the Deputy CTO of the Rand Corporation. Thank you for being here. Next to him is Joe Morosco, the Assistant Director of the Office of the National Intelligence Manager for Counterintelligence with the ODNI. Joe, thank you. And Fran Moore, the Chief of Intelligence for the Financial Systemic Analysis and Resilience Center. So first, let me just thank you for being here and thank the Breakout session room sponsor, Micro Focus Government Solutions. The way this is going to go is we're going to have a discussion here for about 45 minutes or so on the panel, and then we're going to turn it over to questions from the audience. Questions will be submitted via question cards, so go ahead and fill those out as soon as you do have a question. You don't have to wait until the end of the session to submit them. Pass them to the aisle, and the person on the aisle raise your hand so the cards can be collected by the Summit staff who are here in the room collecting them and then bringing them up front to me. This session is eligible for continuing education credits, so if you're interested in obtaining them, please be sure to have your badge scanned at the end of the session by the Summit staff in the back of the room, and an email will be sent out to those scanned after the Summit is over. Lastly, as a reminder, there are media present during the breakout session, not just me, and everything here is on the record, so your friends from the press are here, and maybe I'll have a few things to say about the press's role in influence operations as we get into this. So I'm really excited to be hosting this panel, in part because this question of how we deal with propaganda, influence operations, fake information, whatever you want to call it, that seems to be inundating our information environment every day is something that as reporters we are constantly juggling with, and not just because we're often being accused of perpetuating and propagating it, but we are people who are in the information business. It is our job to discern truth from falsehood, and then to tell our readers or our listeners or our viewers as best that we can what is the truth as we know it right now. So this really kind of goes straight to the core of what I do every day and what others at the Washington Post and other news organizations do. And the people who are here on the panel all have varied and unique experiences, but are also all, if I can characterize them this way, information experts. They are people who understand very much the dilemmas that we're facing, and I think why they've become so exacerbated in the current environment, in the political environment, in the information environment that we're in. So I want to just kind of start this out by trying to get some ground truth on terminology and sort of the dilemma as we see it, and trying to diagnose this issue, if we can, of influence operations targeting the U.S. and the political environment in particular. As of this Friday, I think it is, we will be 60 days until the midterm elections, which now is kind of the official kickoff of the sprint to the November elections. So we are in that particular moment when Americans are paying the most attention to the news. They're starting to tune into what candidates have to say. And of course, this is the period that we know from the 2016 election. It was the intelligence community's unanimous assessment that the Russian government used influence operations to try and persuade voters, to try and sow discord in the electoral system and undermine people's credibility in the election itself. So we are kind of at this moment again. And DNI Coates recently said in testimony, in a speech that he gave, the system is blinking red in terms of what Russia in particular is doing with its influence operations, evoking, I'm sure I don't have to tell people in this room, an analogy from prior to the 9/11 attacks, which I think got a lot of people's attention when he said that. So, Joe, I'm going to kind of turn to you first, I guess, as the representative of the U.S. government here, but I want to start this off with the whole panel too, let's talk about right now the state of play in terms of what we see going on in terms of influence operations. I will presume for present discussion that is mostly coming from Russia. You will tell me if that's not the case, but where do we stand right now in terms of what you see going on in foreign governments trying to influence people's thinking and potentially their voting behavior?
Very good. Thank you, Shane, and good morning. First, I'd like to start with a comment that this is a very complex and challenging environment that the United States finds itself in with regard to countering foreign influence operations. Foreign influence takes many forms, and I'd like to start with making a clear distinction between influence operations intended to affect infrastructure. For instance, our voting systems and voting infrastructure and polling infrastructure, voter registration databases, largely conducted via cyber means, and then foreign malign influence activities that take the form of propaganda, disinformation efforts that are more pervasive, ongoing, regardless of whether or not we are in an election season or not. One of the other things that makes this environment so challenging is that the range of actors in this space is expanding. Obviously, we all know about what Russia's activities are in this space, what they tried to do in 2016 to influence our elections, and our senior leaders have spoken on that point many times, but it's not just Russia. China invests billions of dollars annually in a global media apparatus intended to influence global populations regarding Chinese policies around the world. In fact, they've bankrolled a number of English language media outlets here in the United States as a way to distribute propaganda. We are also seeing a growing range of non-state actors, hacktivists, leaktivists, public disclosure organizations such as WikiLeaks that enabled with cyber tools are getting into this game in a much bigger way, intending to influence the population, fundamentally change how governments and our governing institutions work. Another factor that challenges us in this environment is that these actors are equipped with more tools. Obviously, the focus these days has been on cyber, understandably. The ability through remote access cyber means to penetrate election infrastructure and networks. But it's more than that. It's cyber used in combination with traditional intelligence methods, traditional espionage, agents of influence that overtly and covertly sow disinformation, use of traditional media outlets, economic levers of influence. All of these means are being used in combination to target the United States. And then I would say another challenging factor is the fact that this is not just focused on one target. It is not just our elections. It is not just influential people in the United States. It is the U.S. public. It is our governing institutions that are being targeted by foreign influence operations. It is also academia, colleges and universities around the country that are the victims of some of this activity, plus social media sites. So all of these factors paint a very challenging picture for us in the government as we try to get our arms around the threat landscape.
Fran, can I ask you to talk a bit about what you see the landscape, but also talk a little bit about the evolution of this. I mean, you know, when you retired from the CIA, you were running analysis for the agency. So obviously Russia and what it does to try and influence global events is something you watched very closely. Can you give us a sense of how this has evolved and why 2016 kind of marked maybe a turning point or a peak of activity? Rand, let me ask you. I mean, I know you study very closely social media and the use of it as a tool for this kind of information and distribution. It seems like Americans are highly susceptible to this, that we are kind of a target-rich environment, and maybe it goes to what Fran was saying in that we don't have a repressive government that controls information systems. But can you talk about why it is that, at least from my vantage point, and I think, probably intelligence professionals would agree, this Russian move was so successful, or at least got so much traction?
Well, so first of all, the Russians are not alone in this game, as he pointed out. And in fact, I could almost make the argument that we didn't actually need any help from the Russians. We're doing just fine without them. We have plenty of domestic capability, no shortage whatsoever. So it's a little bit difficult, I think, to really sort of disentangle what the Russians may or may not have done versus what our domestic influence people might have done. For example, what people talk about the fact that the Russians may have spent $100,000 on Facebook ads. There's some discussion about that. But for some strange reason, what you never hear people talk about is the $100 million, give or take, that the Russians spent with an organization like Ketchum. How many in this room know who Ketchum is? But that's what makes it so interesting, you see, because Ketchum is an enormous public relations firm, and almost nobody's ever heard of them, but they're really big, and they're part of a larger conglomerate, for example, called Omnicom, which to me sounds like a name out of a James Bond movie, but there it is.
Many things today do, so that's okay.
What?
I said many things today do.
Yes. And so $100 million they spent, nobody's paying any attention to that. But this is between 2000 and 2014 is estimated that they did that. And the job of Ketchum is to create, and whoever they hire, other public relations firms, American public relations firms, as well as foreign, is to put out stories that support Russian agendas or whoever their clients are. So now you could ask the question, well, how come nobody makes a bigger issue out of this than it is? And one possible explanation is the fact that, well, it could be that, their customer base, I'm not singling out Ketchum because they're only one of many players in the field. Their customer base includes probably U.S. politicians, U.S. corporations, foreign governments, foreign politicians. Basically everybody is using the same people to do the same kind of work. So who among their customers is ready to shut them down or make a big issue out of the fact that they exist? So that's an interesting thing. Then there was another study where this professor estimated that probably up to possibly 70%, and this I would put to you, 70% of articles that you see in newspapers or news sites across the country, and I don't mean the Washington Post or the New York Times, but in news sites and newspapers you see across country, the articles are actually press releases. They're stories that are written by people like Ketchum for their customers to push their agendas and sent to these people who have no money. You see journalists are being laid off right and left because nobody has money to pay them, and then these guys come along, give them free stories, ready-made, ready to go. Take them. And if you want to put your byline on it, great, even better for us. So you can say you wrote it, that's even fine. So if that's even close to being true, that suggests that maybe 70% of the news that people across the country read is manufactured. Well, that's a pretty scary thought. But on the other hand, you don't hear too much discussion about that. And in terms of susceptibility, well, you know what? The American public is not unique in its susceptibility. People all over the world are equally susceptible to this kind of manipulation. I don't think we can single ourselves out in any way. Other places, other governments, they more effectively make use of this. But it's still there. It's everywhere.
Well, let me ask then Fran or Joe to respond to that, because I think what Rand is describing, I think we would all traditionally recognize as lobbying, public relations, right? It's to some degree, it's sort of governed. We're all becoming much more familiar with the Foreign Agent Registrations Act lately, because some people didn't register under it, and that's a no-no. But I think you raise a very interesting point, which is that, of course, foreign governments are trying to influence public discourse, legislation. There's sort of a veneer of transparency, if I can think of it that way. But why is that distinct, or is it, from what the Russians did in terms of putting out demonstrably false information on Facebook or trying to get people to show up at rallies for things that didn't exist? How should we think differently about those two things?
I'll maybe jump in with a partial answer here. I think one of the things, as my colleagues have noted, the foreign influence activities against the United States are seen by many actors as a low-cost way of advancing their broader aims. And I think in the case of Russia, you know, we have to look to the intent of some of these actors behind some of these influence operations. In the case of Russia, the broader intent, sowing division in the United States, sowing division amongst the United States and our allies, and to exacerbate tensions and social issues is part of that broader intent. And actors across the world look at that as an example of how they can further their aims in a, again, relatively low-cost way, using social media, using other platforms to take an issue and either use that issue to paint, you know, a government's policies in a more favorable light, or disparage U.S. policies in particular.
So it sounds like what we're saying then is, or what you're saying is, the three of you, that there's been information operations for a long time, right, of various forms. But what's distinct about what's happening now is it's directly targeting a U.S. population for the purpose of exacerbating already existing, perhaps social or political rifts, and trying to gain traction that way, as opposed to, say, trying to influence a piece of legislation or place stories, you know, via press releases. Do you have a sense of why the Russians thought that this was a particularly useful time to do it? I mean, is there something about the moment of political fragmentation and reliance on social media that we're in right now that said to them, now is the time to really try this?
So I'll jump in on that, and only in the sense that I think information operations in general have to be opportunistic. And so tools to actually discern themes that will resonate, measure resonance at a time where there is perhaps more turmoil and polarization in U.S. politics, just as there has been across Europe for more than 5 years. And again, I'm back to, I think that they perfected some of these techniques on the other side of the Atlantic before it crossed the Atlantic in a way that had impact in the United States. But certainly, information operations has to take advantage of themes that will resonate, and we are in a period of political turbulence domestically that probably allows for that those themes to take root with intensity that they might not have in other times.
So I would add to that. So, I mean, if you look historically, just in the case of the Russians, let's not even talk about anybody else for the moment, but in the case of the Russians, if you look in the beginning of the 50s, the KGB, the first chief director of the KGB, created something called Department D. And D stood for Dezinformatsiya, which was disinformation in Russian. So that was already a department, and that wasn't with the beginning of their activities. That was a recognition of the fact that these activities were sort of distributed throughout KGB operations, and they really wanted to centralize it and really sort of, you know, step it up. At the end of the 60s, Department D was actually elevated to a service. and he became Service A of the first chief director of the KGB, which in the A stood for, in Russian, Aktivnie Meroporiatia, which is active measures. It was the same initials. So that was in the end of the 60s. So from the Soviets' point of view, this is really old news. I mean, you could easily trace this back to the Cheka. You could probably trace it back to the Okhrana before that, which was the Tsarist secret police. I mean, this is ancient history. But what the Russians realized, and what we, unfortunately, have missed completely, is the fact that with the current information environment as it is today, the opportunities to do this kind of work have multiplied spectacularly, right? The cost has dropped to nothing. I mean, you know, when the KGB used to make forgeries, I mean, they had to actually make physical forgeries. They made letters. They had to distribute the letters. I mean, it was really a hassle, right?
Right.
But today, you could do this stuff for pennies. Nothing. I mean, so they can have guys all over the place doing this. So what? It doesn't cost anything. And they can change the story just like that. To make a forged letter, it took a long time and a lot of work. But now they can create forgeries on a continuous, nonstop basis. So at the same time, they've realized that the opportunities, I mean, are so enormous. At the same time they realized it, the United States government, has done basically absolutely nothing to counter these efforts. I mean, basically zero. At DARPA, I ran this program, the Social Media and Strategic Communications Program, between 2010 to 2015, and it was probably one of the largest programs in social media research ever funded by the United States government, and I could not get anybody to listen to anything I had to say. Nothing. Nobody. I was going all over the government, all kinds of places. Can't imagine the places I went. Nobody wanted to hear it. Why? Well, we can discuss that. There's a lot of reasons why nobody wanted to hear it. But the point is they didn't. So while we're doing less and less and less and nothing, and the Russians see they can do more and more, so they can get away with more using relatively unsophisticated techniques because they get no pushback. If there's no pushback, why should they improve the technology? Why do they need to do better? If they ever got real pushback, yeah, then we'll see what happens. But in the meantime, that's how the situation on our end has not improved. And there's a large number of reasons why that's the case.
Joe, do you want to make comments on this theme of the susceptibilities in our system, the vulnerabilities that governments are exploiting?
Yeah, I just would agree with everything that's been said in terms of the dynamics in terms of the foreign threat actors. And I would just add that, as Fran pointed out, that this is not a new problem, right? This goes back decades. Back in the 80s, the Russians had manufactured a story that the Department of Defense had created the AIDS virus as a biological weapon and put that in various media outlets. This issue of sowing disinformation to paint the United States in an unfavorable light goes back many decades. I think what is, as Rand pointed out, what is different about this is the ability for them to do this much more quickly, in a much more targeted fashion, focused on specific communities and issues, and enabled by the social media platforms that are there today.
And it's such an interesting example, too, of the Russians planting this kind of idea of a conspiracy theory, right, about the birth of the AIDS virus. I mean, I wonder if something like that were to happen today. I could imagine that back then you would have scientists and government officials coming out publicly and saying this isn't true, here's what the science says, places like the Washington Post writing about it. And if that happened today, undoubtedly some people would see that as credible, but I wonder if many more people would simply say, I don't believe it, because credibility in institutions has seemed to plummet. I mean, the media is just one of them, but we can talk a little about that too. But I want to get into, now that we've talked about kind of diagnosing what's going on here, what are practical things that people can start to do to inoculate themselves against this, or at least start to learn when it is that you're seeing information that is real versus manufactured for a particular political response. And I don't know if you saw yesterday, but the New York Times did this very interesting kind of quiz where they took actual ads that were identified by social media companies as having been produced, I think by Russia in most cases during 2016, and paired them next to ads that looked like on a similar theme, whether it be about women's rights or minority rights. These were sort of politically issues of the moment. And it said, can you guess which one is the fake? And it was extremely hard to do. Sometimes there were subtle giveaways, maybe in broken English used in one ad versus not in another. But it was really tough to do. So I throw this out to you all, particularly as people who have worked in government and have analytic tradecraft and training. Part of your jobs is trying to discern fact and fiction, right? I mean, truth from falsehood. What are some of the basic things that you do when you're surfing on social media, when you see something coming across your radar screen? What's your professional antenna do when you're trying to determine whether the ad or the story that you're seeing is really legitimate or is fake and put there to try and trick you or persuade you? Anyone can start, yeah.
Well, so I would make one observation first about this. So lots of people talk about media literacy training. For example, in the spring, I was in Brussels and The Hague, and I was on a lecture tour. And this high-level expert group report from the European Commission came out on countering disinformation and propaganda. And one of the major approaches that they were pushing was the whole idea of media literacy training, that was going to solve all their problems. Well, you know what? I mean, let's think about this for a second, right? I mean, we've been teaching arithmetic in school for a long, long time. How many people are really any good at fractions? I mean, actually, not that many. So to expect somehow that something as complex as doing what Shane just described, even if I give you the tools to do it, to expect that most people are going to do that, I mean, it's just not believable. It just doesn't seem like reality. So I don't really see that as being media literacy being the answer to much of anything. I mean, it's good for a few people. I mean, and even if people had the capability or the tools to do it, how many are going to be interested in taking the time? Most people are busy. They get flashed, something flashes before them, they have an emotional reaction, and they move on. That's it. Tools, they're going to sit and analyze it. Yeah, I mean, that's not happening. I mean, that is never going to happen. I'm sorry. Especially when you consider the fact that attention spans of people are shrinking, not increasing. Things are passing by faster and faster and faster. People are just... So it's purely emotional reaction. That's it. Everything is based on emotions. Rational arguments, that's hardly even in the cards anymore.
Okay, that's grim.
For the most people. Well, but it also suggests a way to deal with the problem, but we can get into
Okay,
that.
well, Fran and Joe, talk about like what you do in your day-to-day too, and how you separate the truth from the nonsense.
So I can talk about what I do, but maybe as I listen to this conversation, maybe the most significant thing I would say that any single human being could do would be to share that New York Times article and hope it goes viral on Facebook. Hope that people are tweeting it out. Hope that we're actually getting a debate and a discourse, because I will say that people do learn in these discourses. They learn and absorb disinformation as well as legitimate information, but that is where the discussion is taking place. And sadly, the readership of the New York Times, compared to the target populations for some of the disinformation campaigns, may not be a large Venn overlap. So in that case, I would want the conversation about how to think critically, which is about all you can do as a single individual. I would want the discussion about how to think critically to be happening in those venues where disinformation proliferates. What do I personally do? As soon as I see something in the news that I think is interesting, and I wonder, I do ask the question, do I think this is accurate? Is there bias in this article? But I've been trained to look for bias in everything I think professionally for most of my adult life. I will then Google to see if I can see other news outlets, and then I will Google to see if they're all using the same source, and I'll look at sources because I've been trained to look at sources. But I think that's, and I only do that on something I truly care about, which means lots of things could wash over me, just like any member of John Q. Public, without me thinking critically about them at all. So I do think it's probably too high a bar to expect your average reader to actually be thinking in that critical way. But the best way to get that critical thinking started, I think, is actually to have that discourse in the media. And then New York Times has to let people, like they do, open that article, right? You need to actually be able to open the link. If there's something in there that's going to enhance transparency, maybe the media needs to think about making all of those 100% accessible to anyone who wants to read them, rather than everything behind the paywall, which is some of the thinking. I mean, I'm actually putting this out there. We're going to talk about solutions later, but you can't talk about what can John Q. Public think if some of the information is not actually available to John Q. Public.
Mm-hmm. So in other words, like putting the things that actually have a public benefit, public educational
Yeah.
benefit, thinking about making that something that we
open, so that if they
keep.
do go viral, people can open the links without, I know that there's lots of ways people do it, and they go into browsers and they can get at them, but, if it's been tweeted, they can get at it, but that's harder for those of us in a certain age bracket who are also targets for disinformation to do.
But how many people read the New York Times compared to the entire population of the United States?
Exactly.
All right?
Exactly.
So I remember I was giving a talk, a friend of mine, a journalist, invited me to address her class. She was teaching a class in journalism to graduate students. And I told the students, I said, if you want to write articles which are going to really have an impact on the population writ large, I said, don't write for the New York Times or the Washington Post. Nobody reads that stuff. You need to write, you need to write for the National Enquirer. And the Globe and People and Us,
Right.
because when you're standing at a checkout stand at any market in the United States, in a small town, big city, doesn't make any difference, when you're standing there, what is looking you in the face? It is the National Enquirer, it is the Globe, it is People, it is Us. That's what people read. And if you're going to make a point, you have to write it in those terms, in that style, in the way people who read those understand them. There's a very specific style on how to do that, like there's a specific style for writing for the New York Times. You have to talk to people in terms they're really to listen to. And when I told that to these students, they were all horrified. They said, well, why are you horrified? This is reality, so get over it. If you want to make a difference, then you got to be ready to do what needs to be done.
I just want to say young people should go work for the Washington Post or the internship program. But Joe, let me maybe kick this over to you, and I want to hear your thoughts on this too. But it strikes me that one thing that Rand is putting a spotlight on here is that there is a kind of a gradation in the quality of news and information. There may be lots of stuff that's printed on paper or that's on our phones that is true. That doesn't mean it's accurate. That doesn't mean it's helpful. It doesn't mean that it's trying to be fair or thorough. It may be quite tendentious and look a lot more like opinion than news. But there are these gradations, but they're, I think what Rand's also saying too, is they're not obvious to, I think, many readers. I mean, I'm perplexed, baffled, outraged sometimes by the number of people, including my own family, who I encounter who don't understand that there is a difference between the place where I work, which is the news division of the Washington Post, and the editorial and opinion pages of the Washington Post, and are shocked to find out that we are literally on separate floors at different ends of a large building, and we don't talk to one another. But maybe kind of address this kind of this challenge, and maybe this is because of the inundation of information that people are faced with these days. But what are some analytic tradecraft techniques that people can actually employ to get at knowing how to distinguish what is news that is, sort of junk news that's bad for you versus, nutritious?
Yeah, that's a great question, Shane, and appreciate the comments that have been made on the panel about this. And I would particularly agree with Fran's point about threat awareness. Increasing threat awareness to the public about not only the types of activities that are targeting us from a foreign influence perspective, but the intent of and the actors that are behind them. We have to do more of that, find ways to do more of that. But we have to do that in a way that is devoid of political considerations, doesn't confer any advantage on any particular group or disadvantage on any group, and in a way that protects our very sensitive intelligence sources and methods and operations. I would say in that vein, I would just note before talking about some of these means of thinking about this information that it's important to clarify that the intelligence community in the United States is not, cannot, should not be the arbiter of truth for any content that's posted on social media. Authoritarian governments have ministries of truth. We do not have that here in the United States. We don't want to be the thought police in this country, and nor should we ever be. But I would say that for the American public, thinking critically at the speed of social media is very important here. Consider your biases. Understand the biases when you look at a piece of information. Challenge your assumptions. Consider multiple sources of information. Rarely is any single event described by one piece of information or one source of information. Put it in broader context. These are the kinds of things that analysts do to to understand the environment, and there is no complete understanding of that environment. We have confidence levels in the information that we're assessing, and but looking at it in that broader context, looking at the historical perspective. History is continuously rewritten on issues. So being able to discern how does this one piece of information fit in that broader historical context is important. As we noted here, these influence operations have been occurring for decades. It's now part of the national discourse, and rightly so, but we should be constantly thinking about the actors that are behind these activities, their motivations, and what they are seeking to achieve.
Fran, can I ask a question too? Just based on your career as someone who worked in analysis, you are, I mean, broadly speaking, that is a part of the intelligence community where you are writing products for consumers, right? Your consumers are policymakers. These are people who are reading the information. I'm curious if when a policymaker is presented with product from the CIA, do they look at it as, that's like it came from the New York Times, the Washington Post, and like, I take it that's the seal of approval? Or did you find that there were times where they didn't necessarily believe what you presented? I mean, did you ever kind of get this kind of friction and pushback, or were people just more likely to believe it because the source was authoritative or seemed like it should be authoritative?
So I will answer that, but I want to actually go back very specifically to the issue of bias, because much like, and very akin to prestigious media institutions, CIA acculturates all of its officers, including its analysts, that we need to be as objective as possible in presenting the information. So it is policy neutral, whether you concur with the policy or not. You bring the best information to bear to inform those decisions. So it is an acculturation, it's a credo, it's an identity for the way we do business. The reality is, and I'm not a psychologist, so let me make that clear, every human being brings bias to the table. The best you can do is challenge your assumptions, be aware of your biases, but you have to actually control for bias always in your thinking and in your analysis. We had review processes in CIA designed to help counter that by making sure that there was a corporate sense that this piece of analysis hangs together from a rigor and a sourcing. There is no bias present here. It is not tonal. And when I say tonal, there's nothing about it that advocates or implicitly actually leads you to a judgment that the information doesn't lead you to naturally. All of that process designed to strip away as much bias as possible. But like perfection, you can strive to be perfect, but I do not think you can be completely unbiased. The best you can hope for is to strive to be consciously unbiased. And so I would go back to my journalist friends and colleagues and say, I think that some of it inevitably may always creep in. The process has to do what it can to minimize it to the fullest. I think on the policy side, policymakers are human beings too. They don't all come in understanding all the nuance of the national security order that created CIA and what that ethos is, the ethos of intelligence, which is to be unbiased. So there's sort of an expectation that we would have to overcome that we would actually not advocate. There were some policymakers who would have loved it if we had said, here's the solution to the problem. But to hold back that prescription is just embedded in the way we do the business. If the analysis did not coincide with what they believed to be the case, there would be, I think, some additional skepticism because it simply didn't resonate with the framework that they were approaching the problem. And yes, I believe that there was always the occasional policymaker who believed that despite our efforts to be unbiased, that we had a bias on a particular policy issue. And the only thing that we could continue to do is continue to put forward that analysis to the best of our ability. And when faced with a policymaker who was questioning our objectivity, double scrub, double check to make sure that we were not actually somehow in a hidden way infusing bias into what we were doing. There's a lot of conscious effort to think about bias in that profession. But I will also be very candid with you. Bias creeps into analysis. And I believe probably creeps into journalism. Yeah. So while your editorial floor and your news division may be in different places, there may be an ethos in your institution that you do have to consciously be aware of when you choose to do a story, when you choose to place a story, when you choose to follow up on a story.
Yeah, that's right.
And it's very much the same way in analysis.
Well, there's the phrase objective journalism gets used a lot, and I've always said that journalism is not objective. It is a subjective act. I mean, deciding how to write a lead and which fact to emphasize first or second or third is subjective. It is subjective when we design the front page. You know, they're all, and I think the bias that creeps in, you're right, it's there. I think it's, in my experience, and like a lot of journalists would argue this too, it's not political or partisan bias. It tends to be maybe more of a bias about where we grew up, or a regional bias, or kind of, you know, how the people we generally talk to and how that's informed our thinking. And it's something that we're definitely on guard a lot, but it's a subtler kind of bias, I think, than what we're often accused of, which is that we're overtly carrying water for one particular argument in a political conflict. So let's talk about policies and like what we actually do about this. I mean, as I said at the opening, we're 60 days out from the midterm, so I suppose we're all going to find out sooner rather than later if the Russians do have something in store. But right now, we are seeing debates about who's really responsible for combating this. Right now, the heads of Facebook and Twitter are testifying on the Hill about this very subject of disinformation campaigns and what those companies must do, want to do, can be forced to do, are willing to do to try and combat this. So let's kind of break this down. Let's start with the U.S. government. I mean, this is mostly, I think, what we're focused on at this particular conference. What do you all think is the proper role of the U.S. government in deterring, dissuading, or stopping these kinds of information operations by hostile powers? The appropriate role, and then let's make it clear, the realistic role that they can actually play. And maybe, Joe, you want to start with that.
Okay, it's an excellent question, and I think I will start by saying, as the only government representative on this panel, our role in ODNI is an important one, but this is shared mission space across a range of government agencies. I know Department of Homeland Security, FBI, other organizations are actively working to counter these foreign influence activities and identify and understand where these threats exist. So I am only speaking from my perspective, not for the whole of government effort on this. But I would say, starting with that, I would go back to the point earlier about ensuring that there is threat awareness and outreach that the government is promoting on this particular topic. Sunlight is one of the best disinfectants, and I think ensuring that the American people, the private sector, all of our institutions, governing institutions, academia, is aware of the types of activities that foreign threat actors are conducting in this space, and then enhancing their postures to identify and counter those activities. I think that's probably one of the most important things we can do collectively as a government is to provide that information, share that threat information in responsible ways, but then also listen to what the private sector and others are saying about what's happening on their networks and on their social media platforms. One of the things that makes this issue so challenging for the government is that these are privately owned and operated networks. And the government is not in a position to ensure the integrity of public discourse on social media platforms. But we are in a position to advise and inform about the nature of the foreign threat activity that we're seeing. And I know FBI has already has had conversations with social media companies on this very issue, sharing that kind of threat information. That kind of engagement needs to continue, and is very important to again shining a spotlight on the types of activities that we as Americans find so harmful to our interests. I would say from an ODNI perspective, we've taken a number of steps to improve our information sharing posture within the government, working very closely with DHS and FBI to not only identify and understand these threats better, but to up our collective game in terms of outreach to the private sector to better enhance our security posture against these set of threat activities.
I'll ask Fran and Rand to respond, but I'm going to start bringing in some questions here now because they're actually very on topic to this. So I'll put these out and you can respond to them maybe in addition to other thoughts you may have on the government's role. One audience member asked, at the tactical level, how can the U.S. government counter the use of cost-effective social media tools such as memes to influence American public opinion? So a tactical level question, which goes to this second question, which is very interesting. Which elements within the defense and intelligence community's counterintelligence enterprise should be responsible for overtly countering influence operations? How do we best do this when attribution efforts and tactics are likely classified? Two really interesting questions. Fran, maybe you want to start.
I might defer the tactical one to Rand on the memes, but I think at a strategic level, it starts actually with the transparency that Joe was talking about. So we do have, and I'm speaking with my old hat on, in the classified world, we do have some understanding of the intent and capabilities and possibly even the activities of foreign governments. I think understanding the direction and the targets should then better position us both as a government to detect when there's disinformation present or campaigns underway to influence, whether it's disinformation or some of the other activities that we discussed today, and to take countermeasures either in collaboration with social media providers or companies that may be engaged, and at some level, if necessary, even some legislation to ensure that some action gets taken. And I'm actually going to bring up an area where the media played a critical role in transparency, but that I come back to repeatedly when I think about information operations, and that's the muckrakers period of the early 20th century, when capitalism, which was an absolutely bedrock American ideal, kind of run amok a little bit, put American citizens at risk. This may be a case where our freedom of speech, which is absolutely a critical thing to protect, also puts us at risk. So what measures, and I'm not being prescriptive about exactly what those measures should be, but if we can't come to a collaborative place, what measures is the government responsible for taking to protect the American public, specifically from this kind of malicious foreign influence effort? I would rather see, I think, with the speed of technological change and the complexity of those threats, I believe collaboration between the private sector and the government is probably the best approach to countering it. But there may need to be government oversight and some regulation if necessary, just like we take for granted, that the meat's not going to poison us and that our drinking, not that there aren't mistakes, I'm thinking of Michigan, but that our drinking, water's not going to poison us. At some level, maybe we will get to a place where we have to rely also on government oversight to ensure that to the best of our ability, not eliminate, but at least to protect from these kinds of influences. And that's where the marriage of classified insight combined with monitoring and managing of those platforms in some ways may come into play. So I'm not saying hyper-regulation, let me be perfectly clear about that, but that I do think there may be some role at some point if there's not another solution that comes to pass.
Ray, let me kick it over to you. And we'll just make an observation too as we're talking about this. In October of 2016, there was to some degree kind of the government coming out and publicly trying to alert people to what Russia was doing. When they put out the DHS and the IC put out a joint statement attributing the DNC hack to Russia. It was also a fairly dense statement, and it also dropped on the same day as the Access Hollywood tape and when WikiLeaks started releasing John Podesta's emails. So granted, this was maybe a unique moment, but it does strike me that the government is positioned to provide some warning on this issue to the public. And we know from a lot of reporting at the Post and other places that there was great debate about when to do that, whether to do it, how forcefully to do it. But it seemed to be no question that the government had the ability to warn people and say, look, the stuff that you're seeing coming up on WikiLeaks or the things that you might be seeing on Facebook are part of a concerted campaign by Russia to interfere in this election. So this gets maybe to tactical, strategic issues too, but I'll kick that over to you, Rand, with at least the provocative idea that the government did provide some warning. So it's not like they don't have a role. They clearly did seize an opportunity. It just may not have been as robust as was called for.
Well, the problem with what the government did was that, to come up with a statement like they came up with, it goes back to who's going to read that stuff and what are they going to do with the information? It's so few people, it doesn't really make any difference. If the government really wants to put out a message to people or explain something to people, they have to get down to the people and really talk. I'll give you an example, the Creel Committee. How many remember the Creel Committee, the Committee on Public Information from World War I? Those guys absolutely understood how to work this. So the purpose of the Creel Committee, just to remind you, was it was the government's, U.S. government's effort to sell World War I to the American people. Right? The Creel Committee had at one point over 75,000 volunteers, people working for them, who went out. They have what they called the 4-Minute Men. Remember the 4-Minute Men? They went out. Most of us wouldn't remember it directly, but because it was 1917. But okay. But I mean, what they understood was boots on the ground, in your face messaging and propaganda. That's, Creel didn't like to call it propaganda, but it was actually propaganda in the original meaning of the term. I mean, think about it. The first official office of propaganda was created by the Catholic Church in 1622, and it was actually called out the Sacred Office of Propagation of the Faith. And in Latin, it was propaganda was the word for propagation. So, I mean, they got it. So the Creel Committee, but boots on the ground in your face. So if you really want to get message out to people, you want to really convince people of anything, you have to get down right where people are, which means, so how would you do what Creel did with the 75,000 people? So one of the things they did was in movie theaters all across the country, they called them 4-Minute Men because the 4 minutes in a movie theater, when they took time to change the reels of the movie, they had somebody rush in and give a pep talk about the war, right? In ways that the local people could understand. They had it in multiple languages. They knew who they were talking to, what their audiences were on a local, level. I mean, so tactically speaking, this was really, incredibly fine-grained approach. So today, you have to do essentially the same thing, but in the social media space.
Can I provoke with an idea here, and maybe some people will like this, maybe some won't, but it'll spark some discussion. I would argue that there is a source of information that is going out trying to directly contact American people on a granular level, pushing a particular government point of view, and it's the president's Twitter feed. It seems to me that he is somebody who intimately grasps exactly what you're talking about getting on the ground and telling people a story that he wants to tell, that he thinks that they may want to hear. I'd be interested to know what you all think about that, but I also bring that up because I think what you're describing, if it were a transparently propagandistic government effort, I want to believe that most people would say, look at that and go, no, this is just the government trying to do its spin. I'm not so sure about that, though.
No, well, so what Trump is doing, I mean, he's sort of doing what I'm saying a little bit, but to a very limited audience, right? So he's not
It's
really
not limited.
talking.
It's tens of millions of people.
Yes, but it's not the entire population would be behind everything he's
It's
saying.
a large portion of his base and the voting public,
Okay, of his base, yes.
which is a large number
Yes.
of people.
Yes, but first of all, you can do much better today, right? I mean, you could actually much better. I mean, he's putting out messages that go to, there's no filter on them, they go to everybody. But if I was going to do it, so first of all, what I would do is and we have tools today to do this, to do large-scale community segmentation. I could, on a massive scale, I could identify all kinds of communities according to whatever characteristics I define. And once I've done this community segmentation, I can then estimate, what kinds of issues that each particular community would resonate with. I could take any message that I want to put out, and I could put it in terms that would most resonate with those communities. And I would do it not as somebody from the United States government. I would do it as a credible member of the community, which means basically that I would have essentially agents in place in each community who were able to talk to people in the community in their terms. And it's not about censorship. So, for example, censorship, I think, is a really bad idea in any shape or form. So it isn't about censoring a narrative that's out there. It's about displacing it with a better alternative. So it's not to block the other one, but it's about being on the spot with a credible member of the society offering alternative narratives in a way that seems natural to that community. And today you actually can do those things. Now, some people may say, well, that's really deceptive. That's deception. And I would say to that, yes, but it is deceptive delivery. It doesn't have to mean that the message is deceptive, but the delivery could be deceptive. But if the message is one which is already publicly stated and everybody knows and is publicly derived, but most people in many communities wouldn't want to listen to it, if I then go in and deceptively put it in a form, I mean, think Mary Poppins. How many of you think about Mary Poppins as being a deception agent? Well, she was. You remember the song, "A spoonful of sugar makes the medicine go down"? Well, I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen, that is deception, pure and simple. And so she got it. The person who wrote Mary Poppins, they really got it, right? And I'm saying it's the same thing with messaging. So you could do that, and you don't have to associate deceptive dissemination with deceptive messaging. It's not the same thing. And I think it can be done responsibly, and it has to be done by the United States government. The United States government cannot abrogate its responsibilities to protect its citizens and then go to Facebook and Twitter, who are private concerns, who are not public servants, whose responsibility is not to protect the citizens. Mark Zuckerberg's responsibility is to his shareholders. That's who he's responsible to.
Well, let me throw out a question from the audience and let Fran and Joe can respond to this, because let's continue on this theme of whose responsibility is it. Someone asked, do social media and traditional media have a responsibility to filter out information that may be biased or incorrect? If so, what is the line between that and censorship, and whose standards should apply? I'll answer for traditional media that we do routinely filter out information that may be biased or incorrect. I mean, it's reporting, it's fact-checking. We do a lot of that. That is kind of a core function of what we do. We don't always get it right, but there's an assumption when you read an article that we've tried to do that filtering already. But this gets at the question that's right now being debated on the Hill then. So what is the responsibility of social media to do this? I mean, I think, Rand, your argument is one that these executives would make. We are a platform. We are a company. We are not in the business of policing speech. I suppose the counter argument to that would be, yes, you are a platform in a private space, and you don't have to adhere to the First Amendment. You can kick off whoever you want. So talk about social media's responsibility in this, given that so much of this information is spreading via that mechanism.
I'll take a crack at starting. I don't know that as an American I would be comfortable with legislating a requirement that private entities adopt a specific set of ground rules for operation. I do agree that they are private entities with responsibilities back to their shareholders, so that as long as they are compliant with what the law of the land is in terms of what can be communicated on those websites, I believe that to some degree they should not be the last or the first resort. At another level, if you engage with anyone from Facebook, Twitter, you do find that there is policy about what they will post. So they are determining policy. And I think that the best way to sort of shape that policy is the transparency and debate in ways that affect its market shares. The one place, so in other words, urging towards a sort of a collective sense for what the market will bear, but creating enough visibility into what is posted and what the implications or repercussions of posting unfettered are probably the best way to get internal regulation from private entities. I do think, though, that it is almost always the threat of additional restrictive regulation that sometimes helps drive that debate. And like I said with meat before, if there's going to be certain things that the government can identify repeatably and reliably that they can reasonably detect and should not, that's a debate that needs to be had. And what, again, I'm not in favor of censorship or regulating any industry, but at some point the government's engaged. The government can't do it alone, and some of it will have to be self-policed, but by guidelines maybe that are by the public, by the people, for the people, and of the people. And so we are not at a place yet, I don't think, where that legislation is imminent, but I do think that more broadly on the issues of bias and disinformation and violence and inciting crime and other areas, that's a debate that has to be had. In this particular instance, though, where you can determine when a foreign government is engaged, the U.S. government, I think, does have a responsibility to act, whether it's to inform and make people aware of the threat or to provide, as we do, law enforcement provides private industry all the time with insight when they've got a problem. I think that has to become a matter of fact. More broadly, do I think we need to improve the trust between particularly our high-tech private industry and the U.S. government, which is also a little bit of a victim of the deep state conspiracy thinking that makes many Americans not trust anything that comes out of the media or the government's mouth. And I think that is a more systemic issue in the United States that will evolve over time. I think we are in a period of social upheaval that we will come out on the other side somewhat changed as a society. So I was thinking about your question on President Trump. I think that, regardless of content and regardless of whether, presidents should or should not, because I don't want to debate that, he does have impact. It is picked up for every tweet. It is picked up in the media and broadcast more broadly. And I would be amazed if future presidents and future politicians, their behaviors are not shaped by this. So I think it's something that's not going to go away, but that we as a society are going to have to grapple with. And there will have to be discussion between private industry, the government, and frankly, it's got to become a campaign issue if it's actually going to change at the grassroots.
Well, I want Joe to respond too. So, go. Yeah.
Yeah, I would just add to that again, I'll go back to the comment, the U.S. intelligence community should not be the arbiter of truth of content on social media, but I would say that the government does play a role in ensuring that foreign adversaries understand the consequences of their actions in conducting influence activities against the United States. And so in terms of deterring future activities that could be harmful, applying the full range of tools against these foreign actors, sanctions, diplomatic pressure, law enforcement tools. The FBI investigates instances of criminal activity being conducted against the United States. That's an important tool in the toolkit. So I think all of these, we need to use whole of government approaches and all of our instruments of power to ensure that we're deterring future instances of this foreign interference. I would say China and Russia are doing the same to us, so we need to ensure that we're using whole of government approaches in response to prevent that activity.
And can I ask, because this is two people have asked this now, does the U.S. government, does the intelligence community specifically have the necessary authorities in place to do that, to counter these operations? Is there something more that you all in the IC need to do what you're talking about?
I'm not prepared to comment on specific authorities of the intelligence community and whether they're sufficient, but I would say that I think the first step is ensuring that we have a true public-private partnership. And we cannot do this in the government alone. This has to be done in concert with the private sector, the social media companies, and a range of other members of our governing institutions and our public, to include academia. This is part of the landscape we are in. Social media sites, whether we like it or not, our elections, they are all in the geopolitical battle space. They are being targeted by foreign actors. We need a true whole of society approach that includes that public-private partnership to move forward on this.
I want to ask, so we have about 5 minutes left, 4 minutes really, but a number of people have asked questions. We keep talking about Russia a lot through this, but people are really eager to know what other nation states, or even criminal groups are seeking to weaponize information, to use these kinds of tactics. We've talked about China as one example. Obviously, we've seen propaganda from groups like ISIS and other fundamentalist groups. But do you all see, are there threats that are on the rise that we don't quite have our eye on, that we should be thinking more about, and not just in the mindset of Russia all the time?
So I would say one of the concerns that we have in the intelligence community is non-state actors coming into this space in a bigger way. Again, empowered with capabilities that approximate state capabilities, cyber tools. Some of these cyber tools have been exposed through public disclosures and other means that are now in the hands of a much broader range of individuals, again, hacktivists, leaktivists, that can have sort of an outsized influence on U.S. Government interests in this space going forward is a concern that we have.
So we're in the era of deep fakes. Have people heard that term before? The idea that a video that would be doctored to put your face on someone else's body and to make it seem like you were engaged in some activity that you weren't at all. I think this is even us in the press have been targeted by activist groups that follow us and film us and take comments out of context and try and, manipulate them and push them back out again. So, it seems like that's kind of part and parcel of the same sort of spectrum, right?
And I would just say that the cyber marketplace makes it easier for adversaries with intent to acquire the capability to get good fast at this. What a country like Russia has is those decades of experience understanding the themes, understanding the psychology, understanding the scattershot approach that sort of seeds it in different places. So you may not have as sustained a campaign and therefore one with as much as effective and with as much impact, but in terms of a sort of a micro burst of something that has some impact, I think that there's just more opportunity for that. I may lack the imagination to imagine how other actors might use it in a more sustained way, but perhaps the Chinas and the Russias who've been at it for a very, very long time are just better positioned now to have the kind of impact that they might have liked to have had 20, 30, 40 years.
We only have about 90 seconds left, and I apologize, I'm going to ask you a big question, but I'm going to ask you for a short answer. So it is 60 days before the midterms. In your professional studied opinion, do you think we're likely to see a campaign of similar scope and magnitude of what Russia did in 2016, or will it be less ambitious and narrower? Fran?
I'm going to say that I think that like a terrorist attack, we've learned to harden our targets a little bit more, and we have raised awareness. So whether the campaign has the same effort and scope, I'd like to think that the impact and ability to actually take off will be reduced. And when you have Facebook publishing the takedowns that they did about a week or two ago, it gives me hope that actually we will at least blunt the opportunity because we are now more aware.
Okay. Joe?
I will start by quoting Director Coates, who has stated that we haven't seen any evidence of any robust campaign, kind of what we saw in 2016, targeting election infrastructure here going up into the midterms. That said, there is a persistent and pervasive effort that is underway by the Russians to conduct influence activities against the United States, regardless of whether we are in election season or not. And where we see the Russians seeking opportunities to influence our governing institutions, our public officials, and members of the U.S. public outside of the context of the elections. And that is something we are concerned with, and I'll go back to Director Coates' comment that the system is blinking red.
Okay. And Rand, last word briefly, please.
So I would say you're going to see really big effort, and it's not only going to be the Russians involved. There's going to be plenty of domestic players, too. They don't have a lock. The Russians don't have a lock on it, but the big effort it will be.
Okay, great. Thank you all. I'm going to invite you to join us outside the ballroom here for a networking exhibits break. Thank you for your terrific questions. I got to as many as I could. Hopefully I covered a lot of ground, and thank you to our terrific panel. This has been a really great experience. Thanks.